Hey everyone, welcome to the very first video of r/GameMaker, a video series where we take a look at your questions on the subreddit and answer them in this video. So the first post is from a user called Digital Ronin, and they say, I was wondering if there were any examples or resources covering how one would set up grid-based movement like a roguelike where you can only move one space at a time. Now it's kind of hard to leave answers in, to leave very detailed code answers in Reddit threads or any sort of text form, so I'll read you what I have the best that I can, but then we'll jump into a project and go over how I would implement this. So the first thing I said is I would create a variable called input and an alarm that triggers every X number of seconds, right? So this alarm would just keep re-triggering, and whatever value is stored in input, that is going to be what triggers our movement. So I say this will create snapped movement that can only be activated every X number of seconds, since the alarm is the event triggering the movement. So then I give an example of that, and I say once this is set up, you can just have your alarm reset itself so that it continuously fires and reads whatever function is stored in input and moves that way. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's go ahead and jump into a project and see how we can do this right now. So I'm gonna go ahead and create a new project. Alright, so here I have a project set up. It has a simple player sprite, a simple player object, and a basic room with our player object in it. I have not done anything fancy at this point. I've just set up everything just to show you the sprite player is a size of 64 by 64 and an origin placed in the top left corner. Add a create event for our player, and we're going to define a couple properties in here. Our variable called input, as I mentioned in the answer. So I'm going to say input is equal to undefined. Now this will just start as a null value, which we will assign in just a second. Now the other thing we want to do is we want to add a variable called alarm interval, and I'm going to set this equal to 30 frames. So this is going to be the interval in which our alarm triggers. So now what we've done is we've created the initial variables here, and we want to go ahead and define how our grid is going to look. Now usually I would put this in some sort of grid controller or game controller, but for the simplicity of this project I'm going to just define it inside the player itself. So I'm going to say grid width, or I'm going to say grid unit width is equal to 64. Now I've done 64 because our player happens to be 64 by 64, so it makes sense that our player is going to be the same size as the unit width that we would like to move. So now we've set up an input variable, we've set an alarm variable, and we've set our grid unit width. Let's go ahead and start our alarm and have it re-trigger every X seconds just to make sure we get a nice cyclical alarm system going. So I'm going to say alarm 0 equals alarm interval. And inside the alarm, I'm going to go ahead and create an alarm event, and I'm going to say alarm 0 equals alarm interval. So now what happens is the alarm will, once the alarm finishes, it will reset itself and constantly re-trigger. So if I go ahead and just do some sort of test, I'm going to say show debug message, alarm. Alright, and if we go ahead and run this project, what we should see is a series of debug messages that constantly print. Alright, alarm. And so every 1 second or so, or 30 frames in our game, our alarm keeps re-triggering over and over. Now we don't have any logic in there, so nothing's going to happen yet. But what we want to do is we want to create a series of scripts that are going to dictate how our player will move, and then we can just call that script every interval of our alarm. So let's go ahead and create a couple scripts. I'm going to call this one move left, and I'm just going to say x minus equals to grid unit width. Perfect. And that is all that we're going to do for that script. Now I'm going to demonstrate it with just 2 directions, and this will give you the idea that you need. However, when you go and implement this, you're going to probably want one for every direction. So I'm going to say move left and move up. And I'm going to say y minus equal to grid unit width. Now the width and the height of the units are going to be the same because it is a square grid, so I probably should name this variable something a little more universal, but besides width, which width indicates simply a left and right movement. However, like I said, they are the same width and height because it is a square grid, so I can use this width variable for our up and down movement. So now we've created 2 variables called, or 2 scripts called move left and move up. So now what we want to do is we want to say Well, first thing we need to do is we need to store these movement scripts into our variable so that it can then be read and interpreted by GameMaker. So first thing I want to do is we have our input variable created, but what we want to do is we want to store these scripts. So I'm going to create a step event, and I'm going to say if keyboard check pressed VK left. Now normally we would do all of our player movement inside of this keyboard event. However, we don't want the keyboard itself to trigger the event. We want the keyboard to try to trigger the event, but we want the game to restrict the movement to only a specific amount in a specific time. So instead of moving our player when we press left, we're going to say input is equal to move left. Now it's important that we do not include our parentheses here because we don't want to call our script when we press this. We want to merely store the script as a resource reference into our input. So this would be the same thing as saying input equals SBR player. This is simply an index reference to our resource in our resource tree. So by not including the parentheses, we are not calling the script, but we are storing the script itself into the variable. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy and paste this. And I'm going to say if VK up, and instead of storing move left, we're going to store move up. So now what we've essentially done is every time we press left and up, we're going to override whatever value is stored in inputs. So let's go ahead and add some visual debugging for us so that we can see. I'm going to go ahead and add a draw GUI event. I'm going to say draw text at 1010, and I'm going to say script get name input. So now we know that input is just holding a reference to a script, so we can call this script get name method on input, and it will tell us what script is currently in input. So right now we have input set as undefined, so this is freaking out. We have to have some value set in here. So instead of doing that, I'm just going to say if input not equal undefined, then we will draw it. This way GameMaker doesn't freak out and say, I'm looking for a script here, but you've given me null or undefined, and so now it won't try to do anything. But if I press left, now you can see in our top left corner we're drawing move left, and if I press up, move up. And so as I iterate between left and up, we are changing the value of input to hold a different script there. So now all we have to do is, this is basically 99% of it, in our alarm event, instead of doing nothing here, what we want to say is we're going to say script execute, and we're going to say input. So now what this script execute method will do is it will look for the script that is stored inside of input, and then it will execute that script. So let's go ahead and move our player, since we're only going to be moving up and left. Let's go ahead and move our player somewhere over here, and let's run the project. And now as I press up, nothing happens until our alarm triggers. Now what's happening is up is getting stored in our input variable, and it keeps re-triggering. So we're never wiping it clean at any point. So by not touching anything, the alarm keeps re-triggering itself and keeps moving in that input direction that we've specified. So what we need to do is we need to, after each alarm iteration, we need to wipe the input variable clean so that it forces the user to put another input into the game. Well, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change these events to check, because we want the player to be able to hold down left or up to move. So let's make sure that these are set to check instead of check pressed. And what we're going to do is after we execute the script, we're going to set input equals to undefined. And we need to make sure though, before we run our scripts, we want to say if input is not equal to undefined. So now what we're going to do is we're going to check to make sure that input is holding some value, then we're going to execute input, and then we're going to wipe it clean. And then when the player presses the keyboard again, it will store a new value in input, and then it will get triggered in that moment again. All right, so nothing's happened. I press up, and now we moved up one, but input has now been erased and nothing happens. If I press left, I move left one. Now if I hold left, I keep moving left. If I hold left and up, I move up, because it takes whatever is the most recent keyboard press and reads that. So this allows us to kind of This allows the player to hold down multiple keys and get very precise movement. Let's go ahead and test this theory by changing our alarm interval, and let's set this to 10 frames. So now every 10 frames, we are going to be moving. I hold left, and now you can see we're starting to move a little bit faster. I hold up, and now we have some faster movement in our game. Now you'll notice, I don't know if you'll notice this small detail. Let's see if I can try to recreate it. It's a very subtle detail that we have in this that you might not want in your game. So if I press left and I let go, if I time it right, I can cheat the interval and move faster. There, see, there we got some weird things happening where sometimes I have to wait the full 10 frames and sometimes I don't, because we're catching it right as the alarm is triggering. The reason this is happening is because the alarm is constantly running in the background, and as soon as it gets a value, an input, it executes that. So if we press a button when alarm is equal to 2, because it's counting down from 10 to 0, let's say it counts down from 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, then we input, well, we only have 2 more frames left before our script executes. So we aren't getting that full alarm interval wait from the player. So you can actually cheat the speed and move faster if you're able to time these inputs right before the alarm triggers. So what we want to do is, instead of constantly resetting the alarm every single time we press a key, or every single time the alarm finishes, we actually want to only trigger the alarm once a keyboard press has been put. So let's go ahead and wipe these alarm sets that we have here. And inside of our input move left, we're going to also say alarm 0 equals interval time. Alarm interval. And now I can copy this here, and now I can copy this here. Now, one thing we have to keep in mind though is if we don't do any sort of alarm value checking in this moment, holding it down is going to keep resetting the alarm to our interval, which is 10. So we're going to hold it down, and it's going to say 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, and it's never going to count down. So we only want to do this if alarm 0 equals -1. And this means the alarm is not currently counting. So now what we're going to say is we're going to say, okay, if our alarm isn't counting down, let's assign a value to it. And this means that we can only start that countdown timer once. Now what we could do is we could also do one more check, and we could say if not keyboard check VK up and not keyboard check VK down, we want to set our alarm equal to -1. So now we're saying if at any point the player is not pressing any keys, we're going to turn off the alarm. So this way the player has to be engaged with the keyboard in order to get movement from the player. So let's go ahead and run this project, and now we should have 2 things. Number 1, if we press the key and we let go, the player will not move, and if we press the key, we cannot cheat that timer by getting it right at that last second. All right, so I missed one thing real quick. Let me go ahead and change this. This is not supposed to be VK up, or I'm sorry, not down, but this needs to be left because we've only implemented left and up movement. Now, again, if you were to implement this in your project, you would want to do this for every direction. So you would change this to say, and not keyboard check up, and not keyboard check, or down and right. But for this example, we are keeping it relatively simple. Okay, so let's run it again. This should fix the problem that we just saw. All right, so now I press left and I let go, nothing happens. So I press up, but I let go, still no movement. Now if I press up and hold, perfect. If I press left and hold, great. So let's say you wanted to have that first movement be initial. As soon as you press a keyboard, you move that direction immediately. But then if you're still holding it down, it resets at a very specific timer. So this will allow an immediate first movement, but then if you hold it down, you get delayed set movement. Well, we would get rid of this here. As soon as we press a button, we don't want to set our alarm to our alarm interval, because that will say, oh, hey, you have to wait 10 seconds or 10 frames before you can move. Instead, what we want to do is we want to set our alarm to 1. This will say, we're going to move immediately. We're only going to wait 1 frame before we start moving. And then in our alarm events, instead of resetting input to undefined, we're gonna first check. We're gonna do our keyboard check that we did here in our step event. We're gonna do this now in our alarm events. So we're gonna say, this up here, line 2, this is gonna stay unchanged. We wanna make sure that input holds a value before we execute it. But what we wanna do is we wanna check if our keyboard is still being pressed down once the alarm executes, then we reset the alarm. So I'm gonna say if keyboard check VK up, or, so we wanna check if either of these is pressed. So if keyboard up or keyboard left, we're gonna say alarm 0 equals alarm interval. And what we can do, and then what we wanna do is we wanna say we only wanna reset input to undefined if we aren't pressing any keys by the time we get here. So now let's go ahead and run it and see what we get. So now I press left and I move immediately. But you'll notice we have a bug here. So if I press up, I move immediately, and then there is that alarm that is kind of delayed beforehand. So what's happening is what we're doing is we're setting this alarm equal to 1, and that 1 frame is happening immediately. And then we jump into here and we check for our keyboard. Well, our keyboard is still being held down because we're not pressing it frame perfect. So we press it, we let go, but this alarm has already executed. So we're putting in 1 extra alarm interval. What we want to do is we want to check again if we want to bring our keyboard, we're going to bring our keyboard check back here, and we're going to say if we're not pressing anything, now we want to turn off our alarm. So we took it out for a second just to demonstrate something, and now we're bringing it back to get our final features implemented. So let's go ahead and check. I press up, I get an immediate movement, but nothing else. I press left, immediate movement. Now if I hold left, I move left, and if I hold up, I move up. And it doesn't matter at what time I press it, it is impossible for me to cheat the timer and to get a faster movement. All right, guys, that is everything for this video. Thank you so much for stopping by and watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like and pressing that subscribe button. If you would like your question featured in the next video that I do in this series, please post it to Reddit and see what people respond with. There's a lot of great answers on Reddit, and people are fantastic at giving advice. But if for some reason you still don't feel like you have a good understanding of it, or you just didn't quite get the answer that you were looking for, please send me a message on Twitter or on Discord, and I will try to include your question in the next video. Thank you so much, guys. Again, I appreciate it. Let me know if you like this series idea, because I'm trying to come up with new ways to create GameMaker content that's more than just traditional tutorials. I think this is a great way to engage the community a little bit and still do tutorials and education at the same time. So thanks so much, and I will see you in the next video.